from me and Suzy. It's great to be here again. I worked here for 25 years, and when I first worked here, we weren't Brunel, we were called the West London Institute of Higher Education. And that was a kind of very unpretentious college that was controlled and run by the local authority. And before I went there, I've never worked as an academic in modern times, more than half really. I've always had other work, and so I got this job half-time, and they had a commitment at that college to diversity. So I don't think it's unfortunately, we still haven't sorted it out in terms of diversity, around the issues of diversity, but then it was very unusual for a social work department to be as diverse as that one was, both in terms of the students and in terms of the staff. And it started with concerns around issues of exclusion for Black and minority ethnic people and women, and it moved on to other groups as well, people marginalized because of their sexuality, through other reasons of gender, disability, distress. So I was completely, by accident, really hit upon a goldmine, I think. It was wonderful to work for years in such diverse circumstances. I have to say that. It was a lovely experience, and I suspect that there's been the same will continuing. So just to introduce me, and then Suzy in turn will introduce herself. My background, and Christina's reminded me of her origins in community development, community social work, was really as a community activist. But I ended up using mental health services and living for a long time, as did Suzy, on welfare benefits, which when I was living on them for I think about 6 or 7 years, was not very nice, but nothing I think like as bad as it is now. And then I also ended up using mental health services over a much longer period. And that for me, in a sort of a way, has been the biggest source of insight, I hope, of understanding the experience of other people facing one or other kind of oppression, sometimes oppressions from the services that are meant to be helpful, rather than just the nature of our society and its exclusionary and discriminatory nature. Sometimes I regret the fact that those of us who face one kind of oppression may not necessarily understand that of another, but I'll come on to that, because I think that's something which we can be helped with. So I worked here a long time, and then with a colleague, I went to work at Essex University to take part in a programme there, and then I'm now linked with the University of East Anglia, which is in Norwich, working there. I've also had a long-term involvement in a disabled people's user-led organisation called Shaping Our Lives. So please do look at our website. We've got loads of things that are helpful for people as both service users and practitioners, and it's not public knowledge yet, but we've just been awarded an enormous grant by the big lottery to make it possible for people who are disabled and use services to be part of current discussions rather than excluded from them. And the first one we're starting with is AI, because we feel that AI is a discussion which is going to impact on all our lives, but some people have much less access to being part of it and having a say in it than others, and that certainly includes disabled people. So we're going to do a bit of talking ourselves, and then we'll play it by ear, okay? And we hope it's useful and helpful. Now, I hope this doesn't sound pompous, but I want to start off because, you were talking about thinking about yourself, and I think if we don't think about ourselves, we're not much use to anybody else, really. Anyway, I've thought a lot about myself over my life course, and I want to start with a declaration of belief that I think I try and have guide how I come at the world. It's personal, it's what I've come to think and believe over a period of time. I feel it for myself, and I feel it for others, and I see it as central to my more general commitment to human, civil, and social rights, and anti-discrimination, as important in our personal lives as it is in our professional and social ones. This is what I would want to say. We can only be who we are. This is our strength and may be treated by some as our weakness. We need never feel we have to apologize for who we are, but we know that there are some who would seek to victimize and undermine us for who they want to see us as or want us to see ourselves as. This is a situation of complexity in our actual lives and in politics, and a world that often seeks to oversimplify and distort people's lives. All of these things seem to me to be especially true currently because of the prevailing extreme politics and ideology which we're faced with here in this country and to some extent internationally, globally. And this way of thinking is something that's come to guide me in my understanding of myself and others, and as part of that, of the work that I do and of social work and of other enterprises. And there are some key issues that I want, not at great length, to address today, which I think have particular significance for people as social workers working with people facing oppression and exclusion. And I hope I don't rabbit on too long. I've tried not to do that. One, and any words that aren't familiar or got too many syllables, I will try and explain. And please, I know Suzy's going to say the same, do it, just interject if you want to check something else. So I'm starting off with a bit of attention to neoliberalism and new social movements, then populism and participation, then what's called intersectionalism, then lived experience and experiential knowledge. That's my agenda. So there are lots of other important things, obviously, which I could be talking about, but I've only got so much time, and so have you. And I think these are ones I want to really get to grips with. So let me start with neoliberalism and new social movements. As I've said, my focus over the years has been with people having more say as service users, people like me, many others, and what we talk about as inclusive involvement, not just the privileged few having a say, but us in all our diversity being included so that we can all, in our different ways, from our different backgrounds, with our different ideas and experience, have a say in our lives and our societies, regardless of the barriers and exclusions that we may face. And we did the first piece of work that Suzy and I did together. It was interesting. We were looking in a local area at what, say, people felt over the council, and most people felt none. But it's interesting that the people who felt they got least and wanted more were then, and there were fewer, black and minority ethnic people locally, and young families with small children who felt particularly, I think, that they needed to have more say. Coming back to my focus in this bit, my career has roughly coincided with two key global ideological and political developments, which I think continue to shape our age. Both have had a powerful impact on the issue of participation, which, as I said, is what really matters to me, how we as people can have more say in our lives and society, how people as social workers can help that happen. And the first was heralded by what people call Reaganomics in the US and Thatcherism in the UK, has been the apparently unstoppable rise of what's called global neoliberalism. Now, it was first talked about a lot in this country in terms of austerity, like, oh, the economy's in difficulties, we've got to cut public services. But that was a charade, that was a lie. What it really was that we now were living under ideologies and politicians who said public support services were a bad idea. They were taking money from people who were better off, and it wasn't good for people to be dependent on public services. Cut public services, cut public spending, and if people need help, then why not pay for it, and why not privatize it? And that's where we have got to. And the fact that it's been a disaster in many, many ways, and that's an evidenced disaster internationally, is neither here nor there. Big international global organizations like the International Monetary Fund and more have actually said what I've just said after first of all espousing these approaches, but it doesn't matter, it goes on. And it's going on fiercer maybe than ever. So it's all about unconstrained market. You know, you will pay as much as the market can demand for a home. Completely different from when I was a child. The supportive state, that's not seen as important. Deregulation for profit, privatization, individualized models of causation. It's your fault if you're not functioning well. It's your fault, get on and take responsibility. Exchange relationships, you pay for things, you don't get them from a concern or a sense of mutuality. That's where we are. And that's the one that gets most in our face. But there's another development which people talk about a lot less, that comes much more from the grassroots, and that's what they call the development of so-called new social movements. Now, some people say these are a bit damaging. I don't agree with that at all. I think that new social movements have been one of the most wonderful things that have happened in our world over the last, started in the 70s, so we're talking about half a century, the same sort of period as neoliberalism. And what they've been based on, the people from the grassroots pushing for these, women, black people, LGBTQ people, and so on, disabled people, has been for the equalisation of our identities as people. Some people are not worse or better than others. For our relationships and our roles to be more equal, challenging, seeking to end discrimination and exclusion, a commitment to social justice, peace and sustainability. And they include very much movements around identity, who you are, like I said, the women's and the black civil rights movements, for example, but also movements concerned with issues like the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and so on, and the environmental movement. These two developments have taken place around the same time, but curiously for me, they've pushed the personal and the political in very different directions. So when I was a kid, and I know it's not okay, but it's certainly amazingly different. How I grew up, as a child, it was all about jokes against different people who were different. It was okay to laugh and ridicule gay people or lesbians. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it isn't okay to do it now. Women, and again, the same caveat. Sorry I've had to start, hope that's okay.
Sorry about that.
So the idea of these movements has been to challenge the way that historically some people particularly have been discriminated against, seen as inferior, by challenging that through reframing our personal politics, how we do things as human beings in our relationships with each other. And the most conspicuous example of that historically, and one I think really priming a lot of the debate, was the women's movement, the feminist movement, but it's come equally from other movements, and some brilliant ideas like empowerment have come from the black civil rights movement and other movements too, challenging all those historic assumptions that some are better than others. Now, neoliberalism is interesting because neoliberalism has kind of said what I say, which is we should all have a say in our lives, but when it does it, it talks about it in consumerist terms, like, women have a right to be empowered by buying our makeup or getting thinner or things like that. They have a right to a say in how they're seen as a consumer. We ought to check out what they say they would like to have. We should do surveys. But when the new social movements talk about participation, what they have meant, and what I think people like me mean, is that you have a say to bring about change, the kind of change that I've just been talking about that we've been seeing over our personal lives. And the contradiction that I can't quite get my head round, but I'm grateful for, is that as our formal politics, and only have to think about things like reform to indicate what I'm trying to communicate, and the fascism of people like Farage, they've moved in a really hostile direction, saying things that in the past politicians wouldn't have dared say. But in our personal politics, how we treat each other from our difference, it's much, much better, generally speaking, than it ever was when I was a kid and I was growing up. I don't know if that feels like that to you, but the challenge nowadays from the new social movements to the attacks on indigenous people, to the history of colonialization, those sort of things, let alone on identity basis, where you can't get away with it, at least in formal legal terms, is fundamentally different than it was in the past. Now, it may be sometimes that it only feels like men who rape their wives, men who abuse children, things like that are more visibly seen as, and have to be seen visibly as problematic, and still, as it were, rule the roost. But in my day, those were not public issues even. They weren't even mentioned. And we know how men routinely treated. My mother used to say to me, my mother came from a poor background, she used to talk about Saturday nights when the men would come home drunk and beat their wives up. as a routine matter. That's what she used to say. So I think that this interest in participation in the personal and in the social and the public and the political from the new social movements has played a key part in transforming our society in good ways, but we also must be aware of this other development that's taking place. And I think the level of confusion that there is in our society at the moment is indicated by the recent by-election results in Manchester, where we have one bit of the locality, I think, essentially voting for reform, and the other bit voting and successfully outnumbering the people by voting Green. Does that make sense to people? This very contradictory time, uncomfortable. But the truth is, as I've tried to indicate, that neoliberalism has become the dominant politics or ideology, and we only have to look to the United States to see the impact that that can have in terms of utter extremism. But it's also associated with something else, populism. Now, I've talked about participation, that people, you know, it's not too bad even if they listen to you with what products they produce and you've got a consumer voice, but to have a real say in politics, as women were denied historically, disabled people couldn't even often get into voting situations in the past and were excluded or were in institutions. To have a real say is very important. But what we've been getting instead from neoliberalism has been what they call populism. I don't know how much that's a very familiar word to people. Is it a very familiar word? Not necessarily. But what populism means is that the politicians will talk the language of you having a say, suggest that they're offering it to you, but they're not really, and it's a way of keeping you in line. And we see it with someone like Farage, and indeed, I'm afraid, with perhaps many of the political parties at the moment which have moved to the political right, where they're saying what they think the voters want, but they're not allowing the voters to have a real say in it. And that is populism, and the expression of populism we have now is right-wing populism. It's kind of populism that's associated with control and the marketplace. And there's a kind of a routine to populism, I feel, when I've thought about it, which I think is very grim. And it's this one. Let's say there's many of us. We can be quite a diverse group of people. But the politicians and the people who are running neoliberalism, who are quite a small minority, people talk about them as the 1% and the rest of us as the 99%. They still want to have power. And they know they're not going to get power just for saying we want to have power because we want to do well for ourselves. I think what they want to do instead is convince us that their agendas are actually our agendas. And that's what's been going on in terms of what we've been seeing over the last number of years in relation to the kind of politics of the hard right and what I would call the fascist right. They identify groups that they think other people will feel are the problem. And these groups may be black people, they may be immigrants, they may be disabled people, they may be trans people, they may be one of a number of people that they think they can isolate as targets, that they can, with their media, because they own the media in this country is very right-wing, and that the media that's controlled here includes the social media too, which we know is in a very narrow range of hands. So they think, I know, this is a cunning plan. We'll get all these people to hate these minorities, and then they won't realise that the people they should really hate are us. So they'll hate these minorities, they'll all hate each other, and then they'll vote for us. And hey presto, I mean, it actually works. I find it shocking that, and for those of us of a certain age, i.e. me, I wasn't around at the time, but this is what I learnt about when I was a kid. This is the model that someone, the epitome of fascism, Hitler, the model he adopted. What Hitler actually did was came to power through the power, influence and wealth of very rich people and organisations, then told people, hey, there's some really awful people out there spoiling your lives. These are known as Jews, migrants, people in adjoining societies that don't treat Germans well. Let's get them, and then everything will be all right. Didn't actually work in a way for those people who accepted those words, and it's not working now, but it seems to work temporarily, and I think it's a songbook that people like Trump, of course, use, that's been used in Hungary and has been used here to make us dislike each other and not realise perhaps where our actual interests and our actual concerns ought to lie. And that's the issue of populism associated here with right-wing. And it's incredibly effective. I mean, it gives support to why people think Farage is the person I might need to support. Farage, who said that he will end the National Health Service, which we know is one of the most treasured policies amongst all the electorate. So I wanted to say something about that. And the other last little thing I want to say about that, speaking for myself, is this results in me kind of ending up hating the people who believe in people like Farage. I hate the people, the ones we see putting up the flags, the ones we see shouting abuse at so-called hotels for refugees and migrants. And then I realise that's another part of the plan. You know, that not only will they encourage some of us to hate those migrants, but they can encourage others like me to hate the people that hate the migrants. And it still isn't it's not the right thing to do, because a lot of those people may not be very likeable from my point of view, but the reason they are attacking people is because, as the populists have recognised, they feel under attack, but they're not necessarily able to see where it might be that the attack on them is coming from. Now, is that reasonably clear to people? I hope it's helpful, because I think it's really helpful for social work. Because you remember the last thing I said, that I think many of the people who end up hating people like trans people and so on are themselves dispossessed people. And social work covers the orbit of dispossessed people, whatever their politics. And I think where I may not feel it's very appropriate for very rich and powerful people to tick the box for Farage, I can understand why people who haven't had the opportunities I've had might do. Now I want to turn to something which I think really closely connects with this. And if you missed a bit already, friend out there, don't worry. And that's the word intersectionalism. How familiar do people feel with the concept of intersectionalism? This is not you're okay.
We have a few lectures on this.
You do.
Oh, sorry. We have had a few lectures on intersectionality and also assignments we did in the last semester were quite, I think some of us have done some work regarding intersectionality within our placements.
So that's helpful. You've obviously got some familiarity with the concept of intersectionalism, and I wanted to, working on that principle, that what intersectionalism I think helpfully reminds us is that none of us are just one thing. It may be some people want to make us think we're just one thing, like, oh, you're just an immigrant, you know, or you're just a refugee, or you're just a trans person. But we are other things too, and sometimes they want us, you know, like the world I come from, being a psychiatric mental health service user is not something you really want to boast about. And some of the experience you don't really want even people you don't like to go through. But it's part of you, and the need for it's part of you. And what really changed me and my understanding of it was getting involved in a group of people, all who had the same experience, and feeling, you know, this is not something to be ashamed of, as they taught me, to do with this, that, and the other, but something I can reinterpret with other people in a good way and make sense of. But hang on, there's some of these people are mums, some of them are older, some of them are black. You know, we're not all just the same. We may be mental health service users. That person's got a professional background. That person was a really good driver, whatever. With more than one thing, even if people want us to. And the fact that we're more than one thing is important because it means that we have overlaps with each other. That's what I think you're saying, and that's what I think is crucial. So when we come the way of the propaganda of the populists, that's something really valuable, which the new social movements have reminded us of, that we are all bound up with each other because we are all more than one thing. We may be a lesbian mother, we may be a black survivor, we may be a disabled gay man, all sorts of things. You don't need me to go on and on and on about it, and they are our links and our strengths and where we can find understanding with other identities. And I do understand, and it's been true for me, especially in my background, you know, how you get encouraged to hate certain groups of people. My mother came from a minority ethnic background, but she hated certain other ethnic minorities, and she was ashamed of her own and never wanted to admit it, and it was awful and damaged her and damaged us, her children. So I think intersectionality and intersectionalism is so important because it gives us the connections, the way we can make sense of each other and feel closeness to each other and resist the siren calls to hate. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'll do it briefly, is the second to last, is what people call lived experience and experiential knowledge. You know, I grew up in a world of academia when I was working here where certain kinds of knowledge were particularly valued. The knowledge based on research, the knowledge based on research which believed in the traditional values of research, which were neutrality, distance, and objectivity. That's what they used to say. Research is valuable and has to be, it's true, isn't it? Distanced from its subject, objective, not impartial, and objective, you know, all these things. And then I realized one day, coming from a survivor perspective, hang on, what that means is that if you've had that experience, if it's part of you, then you can't be as good a knower as someone who's just been writing about it or doing research on it, because you're not distant from it, you are being subjective, and so on. And there has been in Western societies, cultures like ours, from I think the 18th century and what they called the Enlightenment, this idea that you've got to prove things in a scientific, testing, experimental way, and that the ordinary knowledge of people who know things isn't as valuable. Well, I don't recognize that. I don't accept that. I think both have their values. And something interesting to comment on, which I've seen reinforced by an official government report, was that when there was COVID, lots of people who were disabled or had other problems had lots of experience of being isolated, of even being restricted to a bed, not being able to go out, not being able to share, not having contact. And they tried to share that knowledge and experience with policymakers, and they got short shrift. They weren't interested. And we know that the way they handled COVID, the way they handled lockdowns, in many ways unnecessarily made things worse. And they never listened then adequately to the lived experience of people who got from other kind of settings and situations an understanding that was relevant. And equally, apparently, they didn't listen adequately to the conventional scientific research. It was a double whammy. But the emphasis I'm putting on this bit is the value of lived experience. And one of the great virtues of social work, in my experience, and I was involved in this, was, at the beginning of this century, about, I think, 2002, social work leaders decided that the experience of people as service users and carers had a value. You know, they weren't practitioners, but they had something to offer because of what they knew from being on the receiving end of social work, and it's still in place. And so they made it a requirement for courses like these to involve service users and carers in the way that the courses were constructed, in carrying out the courses, in being a presence, and also being able to be members of social work courses, people with those sorts of experience on the receiving end. And that's still the way it is, and central government still puts some money towards making that possible. Because of that recognition that lived experience, who we are, what we know from who we are, in all its facets, has a value that needs not to be discriminated against or devalued and seen as something in a separate place or compartment, but in there alongside other kinds of evidence. And that's the last thing I want to say before turning over to Suzy, that I think, because I've worked on courses like this, because I've worked with lots of practitioners doing different things, as well as with service users, I think that practitioners are often almost as devalued as a source of knowledge and insight in policy and practice as service users ourselves. They don't listen enough to practitioners. They don't listen enough to people like you when you're doing the job. And yet, as a friend of mine said, there are two people in the social work relationship. There's the service user, the client, whatever you call them, and the practitioners. They're the key voices, not some outsider, the policy maker, the senior manager, or perhaps even the researcher who's listening to the expertise of the policy maker and so on and so forth. And so my final appeal is to have a confidence that people do have a need to listen to you, and that your experience as learning practitioners, but all you bring to that experience from your own lived experience through your intersecting identities is as important as the book learning and the placements that you do here. That's what I want to say. That would be my final message. To try and do that which is most important for practitioners, to help instill the confidence you need, because it's such a tough job, as you know, and to value what people call people's practice wisdom. When people practice as good practitioners in social work, they don't just bring the toolkit, the books they've read, the things they've been told in sessions like this, the placements they've been and what the other people said there. They bring the whole of themselves, and they bring it in a way where they're using it in a good way in its max. They're not bringing it to say, oh, that's what I thought about my life, so it must be the same for you. They're looking to the person. Does that make sense? So I'll stop there and hand over to Suzy.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, my name's Suzy, and what I'm going to talk to you about, hopefully, is the lessons I've learned in my working life as a palliative care social worker, and I'm now a welfare rights advisor. I'll come on to explaining that. As Peter said, though, at the beginning, before I start, if you want to say anything as I'm going along, please do. If you've got any questions or you want to make some comments, I don't mind being interrupted. Before I start, I just wanted to flag up a little bit about a concern and interest I've always had, which actually relates to what Peter's just been saying, which is about the role and the voice of the social work practitioner. And I, very early on in my career, realised that practitioners don't have a lot of say. And social work practitioners don't always shape how social services are run or managed or what they're going to do or anything. So I was involved in something called the Association of Palliative Care Social Workers, and variously the chair of it, a service user involvement officer, a regional representative. And that was very important for us in flagging up the role of social work within palliative care. And I'm happy to say that social work was seen as a valued part of the services offered to people with life-limiting and life-threatening illnesses. But I don't think necessarily social workers in other fields have had so much say. But I was involved in several organisations trying to raise the voice of social work. One was Help the Hospices. I don't think it's called that now, but it was a national charity, which called for representative practitioners to be on its board of trustees. And I was nominated by the Association of Palliative Care Social Workers. It was what I'd call a bruising experience, and not one I look back on with much happiness. I can't say I was too sad when my 6 years tenure as a trustee came to an end, but I think I did achieve some things with other people. But years later, I met a nurse who'd been on the board who told me it had been the most terrible time of her life, and she'd hated every minute of it, and she'd had to leave because she thought they weren't taking any notice of her as a nurse. And I said to her, oh my God, I said, why didn't you tell me you felt like that? I didn't know you were thinking that. I was also involved in something called the National Council for Palliative Care, again, on their board, and something that was sadly very short-lived, which I don't know if any of you remember, called the College of Social Work, which was an initiative set up to be the College of Social Work and to advance the voice and cause of social work. But it didn't actually last very long due to all sorts of political machinations. So I was a palliative care social worker for 28 years. I'm assuming everyone knows what palliative care is? Yeah. When I started my working life, it was called terminal care. and I worked in something called the Bloomsbury Support Team, which was a terminal care support team for people with cancer and their families. And we were based in the old Bloomsbury Health District in the London Borough of Camden. And I was actually employed as a social worker by Camden. And then I went to work for St John's Hospice, which is actually in St John's Wood, and it's the hospice for central London. And I eventually became the social work and bereavement team leader there. Working at the hospice actually meant working with an extremely wide range of people and groups. And that actually included the staff, as I'm pleased to say, as well as the patients and families. So we were working with adults with life-limiting and life-threatening illnesses, their carers, their families, bereaved people and bereaved children from all walks of life. And that included all the difference there is in age, class, ethnicity, sexuality, mental and physical health, religion, and citizenship. And we actually worked with a lot of asylum seekers and refugees, including refugees who'd actually had their leave to remain denied and who were waiting to see what would happen, and some who were waiting to be deported. So as well as supporting people emotionally and practically with their illnesses and bereavements, we had to help people access a whole range of services that were meant to be there for them. But whatever people's situations, services are often hostile and unresponsive. I mean, my heart used to sink when somebody would phone me from the ward and say, Suzy, somebody needs help with rehousing. And if they lived in Westminster, it would be like, oh, help. This is going to be virtually impossible. Or, again, people had enormous problems with the benefits agency. Even when you would think, you know, they're terminally ill, you would think there'd be sympathy, understanding. They might still face exactly the same problems as anyone else. So after we left Norwich, there weren't any jobs in palliative care social work in Norwich and Norfolk.
After you went to Norwich.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, after we went to Norwich and we left London. Yeah, I kind of realised there's not going to be any jobs in palliative care social work in Norwich or Norfolk. Norfolk is a little bit behind. Just to let you know that once when Peter and I went from London to Norfolk on the coach driver said, we are now in Thetford, which is in Norfolk. Please put your clocks back 40 years. And everybody laughed. It isn't quite as bad as that now. And Norwich is actually quite a forward-thinking city. But I'm afraid there aren't really jobs for palliative care social workers. So I Googled welfare rights jobs, as I had come to know quite a lot about welfare rights in my work in London, and a job as a welfare rights officer for Age UK Norwich came up straight away, and I applied and I got it. So I work with people who are aged 50 and over. We actually work we work with very old people, but not just very old people. We work with people from 50 and over, and a lot of our clients are people who are just 50, who might have a lot of problems with mental health, physical impairments, lots of issues, and there basically aren't any other organisation to support them. The Citizen Advice Bureau in Norwich is absolutely overwhelmed with people needing help. So I've always been a practitioner throughout my working life. And what I want to say very quickly is, and I hope it will come on and be evident, is that what I've really valued most, I think, is that it's always been for me a matter of perhaps practical tasks as well as the most complex psychological and interpersonal issues. And that's something that I think I've really appreciated in my working life and has been really important to me. And I don't think I kind of realised it would be like that as a welfare rights advisor. I think I thought at first, well, this is quite a defined task. I do a certain number of visits a day, I do a certain number of benefit applications a day, and then I've got time to do all my paperwork. And I kind of realised quite early on, oh, no, there are a lot of people there who need a lot of help, and their help isn't there, and they've got no one to talk to, and they're dying, needing to talk to somebody about the things that really matter to them. So I think that what I'd like to come on to then is that the first thing, which perhaps I've touched on is, as a social worker, is that I realised quickly how hard and stressful life is for so many people. And I do try, as I'm sure you do, not to make assumptions about how people are coping. And it's obvious that some groups face much more difficulties than others. But I've realised that there are people who are excluded from our society in ways that might not seem obvious. For example, I'm continually meeting people now who wouldn't necessarily count as particularly old, but they've got no access to modern technology. They don't use the internet, they don't have a mobile phone, they can't do emails, and people who are years younger than me will say to me things like, oh, you know, people at our age, we can't do emails. Oh, that's not something I can do. And they're really scared of it, and they can't do it. Consequently, as I'm sure you all know, practically everything is online now, even when you go and park your car. In Norwich now, you have to apply for your parking permit online. And I'm not actually sure what you do if you can't do it online. But there are so many things like that. And I think that does actually include people of all ages, abilities and classes. And I've realised how alone and lonely some people are. Also, I've realised that, and again, I'm sure you're aware of this, that so many people have absolutely no idea how the structures in our societies work. I'm always meeting people who have no idea that it's not Age UK that decides whether they're going to get a benefit like attendance allowance or universal credit. They actually think we're deciding that, and I have to try and explain the role of the benefits agency. But it's absolutely crystal clear to me how terrified people are of the Department for Work and Pensions. And they think their benefits can be cut off just like that. Now, obviously, that does happen to some people, and it's happened to somebody who I've just been working with, where we did his claim we did his review for a benefit called personal independence payment. I did it with him. We sent it off, and he got it back through the post about 3 weeks later from the Royal Mail with a sticker on saying they hadn't been able to work out the address. I've got no idea why they haven't, because it goes into an envelope with a window in, and I put it in and you turn the form around and you put it in, and but it's just got this sticker on. The next day he gets a letter from the benefits agency saying you didn't send your form back, so we're stopping your benefit. So it can happen, but generally speaking, there are rules and regulations about stopping people's benefits. When they're brutal and they may not be fair, but there is the right of appeal. And there are ways of sorting things out, but people don't realise that. They think things can be very arbitrary, and they do seem arbitrary, but they don't realise there are mechanisms, there are some controls about how things are done, but people do not realise that, and they actually don't know who's doing what. And when that happens, I think you are very disempowered. So what I want to do is talk to you about, from my perspective, what I think really good social work practice looks like, based on what others have called a participatory approach to social work. So just to explain what I mean by that, for me, participatory approach is based on a model of person-centred support for service users. And that's that Peter and I were involved in a project called The Standards We Expect, a project funded by something called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And we looked at the ways in which people and services were working in different, what we call person-centred ways, to enable people to get the support they needed in their lives. And what that was defined as means the service user is at the centre of the service, and services should work with the service user to help them live the life they want. It's not just about them fitting into an existing service and accepting what's on offer. And the project identified the core values of person-centred support from service users and others as being inclusion, respect, independence, and personal choices. And these, I would argue, are the values that lie at the participatory approach to professional practice. And I hope that a participatory approach involves working in partnership with service users to build a relationship of trust and mutual respect. And it means really listening to what that person has to say, discussing with them what they're most worried about, what they want to happen, what are their hopes, their fears, their practical problems, and so on. And it's not just about a professional telling a service user how things have to be and how they have to be done. I think what's very important to remember, as I'm sure you all do, is that each person is unique and has their own thoughts and feelings about what's happening to them. And it means taking into account issues of diversity and cultural and social differences. So in palliative care, you are often meeting people approaching the end of their life, and you may only have one chance to get it right with them. It's very important, I think, and I do think this is true of social work generally. It is important for people to be able to tell their story, however long it may take, and even if you feel you've heard it all before, and it's getting in the way of getting on with the task of the job in hand. The same, I think, is true in my work as a welfare rights advisor. In this job, I'm going to help people access the benefits they're entitled to. And as I said, I think the practical help and advice that you can provide is crucial, and never underestimate that. But I think you do have to let people say what matters to them. It is important to you as a professional and the service users to be able to develop an agenda for future action together. And for example, that may be that you'll undertake to help with or access them with practical tasks such as claiming welfare benefits, or trying to help them with rehousing, or agreeing to meet and talk more about the support that person needs to cope with what's happening to them. And I think at this stage you have to be, it's crucial to be clear, honest and open about what support you can or you can't offer. For example, if you know that it would be impossible for someone to be rehoused or access social care from their local authority, then you need to explain that clearly and honestly from the start. Or you know that due to local state financial cuts or strict eligibility criteria, what they want is just not going to happen. You have to explain that to people and be honest with them. My experience is that most people can cope with knowing what the limits and boundaries of what you can do and will do, as long as you are, and they will appreciate honesty and openness. And I think that a participatory approach does mean that you have to continually discuss and reflect on the work that you're doing with the service user, and involve them in that discussion, and being prepared, if you can, to be flexible about what's needed. I think it's important, as I said, to go at the service user's own pace, and I appreciate there will be constraints on people, and people here will be working in all different areas and fields of social work. So sometimes it may not be possible to do as much as you would want to. But I think if you can, going at the service user's pace is important. I want to give you an example of a patient I worked with at the hospice. And I'm going to call her Mercy. That wasn't her real name. She was a young Black African woman, and she had had breast cancer and had metastasized to her brain. It had gone to her brain. So Mercy, at the time, had been admitted to the hospital. She'd been living with her mother, but she'd become extremely ill, and she and her mother spent all day at the hospice with Mercy, but they rarely spoke to each other at all, and neither of them were communicative with the staff. So it was quite a tense situation. They weren't talking to the staff didn't know exactly what was going on, they didn't know really how to help. They didn't know what Mercy understood about her illness or her mother. And they asked me if I would get involved. So I went up to Mercy's room to talk to her. And her mother was not unfriendly, but was extremely reticent. But what did become clear at the time was they were very worried about Mercy's welfare benefits, and she didn't have enough money to live on. So as a starting point, I got involved in helping her claim a benefit called personal independence payment, which is a benefit for sick and disabled people over the age of 16 and under state pension age. It was incredibly complicated because, unknown to me, she had already started a claim on the telephone but never finished it, never progressed it. So this complicated it. And I had to get Mercy to speak to the DWP on the phone to give permission for me to speak on her behalf. That was quite difficult because, due to her brain secondary, she was quite disinhibited at the time and was incredibly rude to the advisor on the phone. So I took the phone into another room and very quickly explained to the advisor, who then was very sympathetic and kind. And I said, she doesn't mean to be rude, she actually can't help it. Anyway, I got it sorted out. We got the benefit sorted. And I think they were very relieved, very pleased. And at this point, Mercy was quite a bit better. She'd had radiotherapy to her brain, it had taken effect, and she went home. So I kept in touch with her at home. I went to see them at home, and they were still very uncommunicative. I couldn't really work out what was happening. I sensed always that there was something wrong. They didn't talk to each other. But one day when I was in the office, Mercy phoned me in the office and told me that her mother had told her she should leave, that she was now a lot better, that she had not ever had a very good relationship with her mother. And prior to being admitted to the hospice, to being diagnosed with the brain secondaries, she'd actually been living on her own in a flat and working, and was really enjoying her life and really enjoying her job, and had to move back in with her mother because she couldn't pay the rent anymore and so on. And now her mother perceived she was better. She wanted Mercy to leave. So it was agreed I'd help her with rehousing, and eventually, with the help of the local MP, I managed to get Mercy rehoused. And I went to see her. They'd got her, the local authority had got her a private rented bedsit. And when I'll never forget when I got there, I felt really dismayed. It was this pokey little bedsit. But Mercy was absolutely thrilled with it because it was, again, her own home. And I realised it doesn't matter to her that it's a small little room. This is fine. It's what she wanted. So she talked about her life. She told me a lot about herself, and she told me about her mother, her relationship, her hopes for the future, and so on. So I think, using a participatory approach with Mercy, I had ensured that she could take the lead in setting the agenda and agreeing our work together. But obviously, not everything can be exactly as the way you want it. It does bring its challenges. Obviously, service users are experts in themselves, but professionals are also experts. One of the heartbreaking things was that Mercy would talk to me about how her brother was bringing up his children in a way which she didn't fully approve. I think they were a bit of a pain. And she talked to me a great deal about how she was going to bring up her children. But I knew that Mercy would never have children. But obviously I couldn't say that to her because we never had an open discussion about Mercy dying. She never spoke about dying, and she never acknowledged she would die. But what happened was that Mercy and her mother's relationship improved. They went on holiday together, and after Mercy died, her mother phoned the hospitals and said it had been really helpful and to thank us, and she actually accepted bereavement support with a colleague of mine. And as I said, conflict can still arise between service users and practitioners, even within a participatory framework, and I'm sure and that will have come up for you. For example, I've worked with mothers who are extremely reluctant to tell their children they're dying or to make any plans at all for a child's future. They, not surprisingly, articulate this. They want to carry on for as long as they can, as normal, do the normal things that they can with their children, and make plans for the future. But there is a clear conflict of interest here, because if a mother is imminently dying, her children need to know, and they need to know what's going to happen to them. And they need to be prepared for a traumatic event as much as any child can be. And on those occasions, time may be very short, and going at a pace dictated by the service user may just not be appropriate if the children's interests are to be served. I think it's important to recognise the importance of open, honest discussion, being prepared to tackle difficult issues, and knowing that a participatory approach means that difficult questions will have to be raised and addressed. And there may be times when a relationship with a service user will be frayed and a lot of anger is expressed. I worked with a service user who had serious mental health issues and who disclosed to me that he planned to commit suicide. I explained to him that I had to then advise the consultant in the hospice that this was not something that I could keep to myself. And it was important that it was shared with the wider multidisciplinary team. And he was furious and talked a lot about that bloody social worker and what she'd done. And he was actually sectioned. But later on, he did come back to the hospice, and he died in the hospice, and he did accept that, yeah, it was the right thing to do, and that we were helping him. But it can be difficult sometimes. One of the worst telephone messages I've ever had on my phone in the days when people had answer phones was from a man who phoned up because we'd had a mother who died and left several very young children, and her youngest child, a little boy, had sort of disappeared off the scene, and his father wouldn't say where he'd gone, and the nursery teacher phoned me and said, should she report him as missing, because it was the time when, I don't know if any of you remember this, but they found the torso of a little boy floating in the Thames with a pair of orange shorts on. And in fact, they never did identify who he was, where he'd come from, or what had happened to him. And the nursery teacher said, should she inform social services? And I said, yes, I thought she should. And I also explained to her that the police officer had already phoned me to flag up that someone else had commented this child was missing. Now, it turned out that the child had been placed in foster care, private foster care placement. He was perfectly fine, and his older sister phoned to say, she had been to visit him. But the father was absolutely furious that I had advised the nursery teacher, yes, contact social services, and I had phoned the policewoman who'd also phoned me. So that did not go down well. And I got this terrible, terrible answer phone message. But I think, as social workers, we have to be prepared to accept there will be times when we have to do things that are very difficult and which service users will not like. And I have to be clear that father never went on to accept any bereavement support or allowed any of his children to come to any of our children's bereavement days. I think similarly, our participatory approach does not have to have all the answers or being able to solve all problems. I think that, again, it's important to recognise that the values of personal choice and autonomy mean we must recognise that service users won't always make the choices that we as practitioners feel are the best ones, but it is their right to do so. I worked with one man who did not tell me for many, many months that he was actually sharing a bank account with his son, who was then systematically taking this very sick man's benefits out of the account and spending them. When he finally told me, he was absolutely adamant he didn't want to involve the authorities and he didn't want to get his son into trouble. But what he agreed was that we could open a separate bank account and contact the Department for Work and Pensions and get them to pay his benefits into that account. And similarly, I recently went to see an elderly woman who said she'd wanted advice about something called home responsibilities protection. So after I'd quickly Googled what home responsibilities protection is, because I just couldn't remember what it was, I don't know, do any of you know what it is? It's basically about women of a certain age who claim child benefit between certain years could have extra national insurance contributions added on to their state pension contributions, so that their state pensions would be increased when they reach state pension age. And you have to know whether you were getting child benefit over those relevant years. And I think that was something that Tony Blair may have introduced, because of the recognition that a lot of people were carers, and it also applied if you were claiming carers allowance and someone was getting income support as a disabled person, and if you got child benefit, and it meant that your recognition as a role and work as carer was being valued. Anyway, so I looked it all up, went armed with the information. When I got there, this woman who's 83 told me straight away she'd already looked it up and didn't realise it applied to her. But she hadn't phoned up to say, oh, I don't need the appointment. And when I got there, I realised very quickly why. And this was because she wanted to tell me in enormous detail about the history of her relationship with her son, who has mental health problems, whom she described as a chain around her neck. She also described him as they were a team, but then she said, but I think the team is mostly me. So what became clear is that she knows he's taking enormous advantage of her. He's taking a lot of her money, and she can't talk about it within her family because her grandson, who she brought up, who's the son of one of her daughters, and her daughter, who lives nearby, are very angry with him, won't speak to him, have told her she's got to stop doing this, as have her friends. But her son's got mental health problems and she feels guilty if she doesn't support him. She said she knows she's given him a lot of money and she writes it down on her bank statements. She doesn't write it down on anywhere else because she's frightened that her daughter will see it. So I said to her, well, would you like to show me your bank statements? She hasn't got them online, she's got paper bank statements. So she showed me her bank statements. And I could see straight away that on one of them it said £75, then 3 days later £875, and so on. And I said to her, well, do you know what the £875 are? Well, that was for his car. Something went wrong with his car. So he needs a car. I said, I'm not saying someone on benefits shouldn't have a car, but do you know why he needs a car? Well, yes, he says it's for his mental health. He has to have a car. And I have to help him with the bedroom tax. Does everyone know what the bedroom tax is? So I said, okay, he lives on his own and he was rehoused by the council because of his mental health problems. I said, so do you know why he accepted a 2-bedroom flat? Well, yes, because his children might have come to see him, only because they live somewhere else in the country, but they don't come and see him because they don't have any contact with him. But in case they were going to, he took her 2-bedroom flat. So now she has to help him with that bit of the rent that's not covered by his housing allowance. So I did say to her, this really does concern me. I am worried for you. do you know he's financially abusing you? And she said, yes. And I said to her, do you know what safeguarding is? And she said, yes. And I said, do you know this could be classified as a safeguarding issue? She said, yes. I said, would you allow me to make a safeguarding referral to Norfolk County Council? She said, no, I don't want to get my son into trouble. So I had to leave it. But I suppose I hope that it helped her to tell me about it. It's frustrating for me. I felt very worried for her, but I have to know that her son, at the end of the day, her grandson and her daughter do know it's going on, but it's something which I can't solve. I think what is crucial as workers is that we're not afraid to challenge or confront difficult issues, but just to offer support to service users sometimes to live their lives in the way they think's best. I hope that is one example, but there are occasions when I felt terribly frustrated and disappointed when a service user hasn't taken a highly desirable council flat in spite of all my advice and has gone for something in a private rented sector because it's nearer the hospital or something. I remember once a service user said to me, oh, Suzy, he said, I can see by your face you think I've done the wrong thing. What can you say? So outcomes can't always be measured in ways that are clear-cut, and you may not always know what the results of your intervention are. But I think what's so important is that service users know there's someone they can rely on. I just want to very briefly mention something which I looked at again the other day, and I did feel quite pleased with it, really. It was only a very small survey. A colleague and I did a very short survey of service users in the hospice. And we asked the question, what has been the most helpful thing for you in your contact with the social worker? The survey was not brilliant. We got about 50% response rate. We weren't able to cover all the areas we would have liked and do it in the best way. Obviously, we had to do the survey ourselves. There was no one else who would do it. But I just give you some quotes, which I thought were really helpful. Honesty, objectivity, helping me to be less manipulated when I'm my most vulnerable. Being treated with dignity, patience, willing to find out more information. Most important is when they showed care, love, offered help that they can give to me and made me stronger to face my illness. And perhaps I think maybe the last is the most important, that if we as professionals offer support in the right way, that is in a participatory way, then of course we can't make everything all right all the time. We can't solve all the problems, but perhaps we can play a crucial part in enabling service users to feel stronger to face their problems and difficulties, to know they're not alone in their struggles. And sometimes I think perhaps the most simple intervention can be really helpful to people without us even realising it, how much that means to people. For example, I must admit I was absolutely amazed when one woman phoned me just to thank me effusively for getting a blue badge for her mother. Blue badges, so disabled people can park. They are absolutely almost impossible to get in Norfolk County Council. I actually do say to people, I think Norfolk County Council are bonkers. They refuse people for no clear reason at all. And this woman who's 93 and can't walk had been refused. But I managed to get her one on the second try. And she just said to me, I can't thank you enough. It's made a huge difference. As soon as I met you, I felt there was someone here who would listen to what I said, and the blue badges made all the difference to me. And I have to say, blue badges are not the most important part of my job, but clearly for that woman, it was crucial. And another man who's got really serious mental health differences just phoned up and said to me, I want to thank you for being yourself with me. Social work isn't easy. We may have to confront and challenge people in ways that are hard and difficult, but if we treat people with respect, dignity and care, respect difference and diversity, then I think that's what makes good practice. Thank you.
What should we do next?
Any questions?
Well, we can take questions so we can have a short break, and then if there are any burning questions, I'd say, and then we have a short break, and then we come back.
You know, oh, sorry. Yeah, so I don't know whether it's directly related, but you mentioned about the far right, especially reform. And I was watching a news article recently where in their leaflet for the local elections, because of the 7th May last year or 2 years ago, they were saying they have to cut services so that they don't have to increase council tax or freeze it. But they've cut the service and they've also increased council tax. So obviously they were not telling the truth. But when asked the chairman, I think it's used to something, he said they never said that, even though the interviewee or showed him leaflets, that was important to say that. So just an advice, how can we confront such people?
I think it's a good question. I think that most human beings, most of us actually are used to telling the truth. I really do believe that. Most of us are used to telling the truth. We might tell a white lie, we might get things wrong, and we actually assume, that's why I think it's so easy to con people. We actually assume that other people, when they say things, they're true. I really do believe that that's how it is for most people. And maybe I'm naive and I have a benign notion of human nature, which I know many politicians don't. They think we're ultimately selfish creatures. I don't think human beings are. But I think there's something about politicians who are on the rise. There's no doubt that politics, when I was young, has significantly changed. Politicians will do and say things which would never have been feasible to do or say in the past, and they will act in ways. The levels of corruption at whatever level, whatever meaning you attach to it, that go on in British politics, which I'm not saying have ever been non-corrupt, but they are certainly more obviously corrupt, across parties, are unprecedented. And I think I've noticed with someone like Farage, for example, that his great ability is, which I think very few of us share, is to be able to get up on his hind legs and say anything as if it were the truth. He can do it quickly, he can do it without any hesitation. Sometimes he gets confronted, but mostly, in fact, he gets an easy ride. And I think that would be true also of the leader of the Conservative Party. But I read Private Eye, which is sometimes helpful because, a bit like The Guardian, often, it is a bit of a measure of truth and history. And it had a little thing the other day about what our present Prime Minister, I don't know if he still is at the moment because I've been reading him, but what he said is the key issue. So it had gone through, and Private Eye identified over the recent past the key issue, and it was about a dozen different things. And I think there is a problem with our politics which I think people have now come to accept, which is very dangerous. They do not trust our politics. They do not trust what people say. I think what we need to do is to find out and stick with certain truths. The truth that I have in my head is that I know that the amount of tax people pay now is more than people have ever paid before in peacetime Britain. It may actually also now extend to wartime Britain. Obviously, in war, you pay vast amounts of tax because it's seen as an emergency. But the levels of taxation now are unbelievable. And yet we were told, if you go with us, we're a low-taxing politics. And that's come from the Conservatives of Mrs. Thatcher, through the Lib Dem alliance with the Tories, through until now. It's never been so high. And yet we've never had such poor services. And I think, going back to what Suzy said, it's very difficult for ordinary people to negotiate all this. We are not helped in our education to understand politics. The lesson I learned, someone put it very well. I remember my best teacher said to me, what you've got to learn is to be able to ask why. And I realised mostly at school, you get told why. Unless you go to a private school, they're more likely to help you learn to ask questions so that you can be a more curious, accusatory, inquiring member of the public as a privileged member of the public. So that's one thing that's important. The other thing, which I saw entirely by accident on a little documentary I happened to watch from the 1950s, and it told us about this. Now, it's a town city where one of our daughters went to live, which I didn't know. And when we've been there, she's moved now, but when we've been there, it's near Manchester. Stockport. It looks so declined. And the inner city, the centre, not up to much, lots of shops closed, everything. And then on this documentary, which from the 1950s, it looked such a lively, bright place. And they explained in the documentary, without thinking, that half the money that came to pay for local services came from central government. Over the years, from Mrs. Thatcher particularly onwards, the amount that central government pays for local services has gone down, I think now to less than a quarter. And there's a reason for that, because their system is that you should not pay more taxes if you're richer. You should pay no more than if you're poorer. And of course, people pay, if you're paying taxes on what you buy or parking, everyone's the same. So it's same rich person, poor person. And those are things that, for me, keep me knowing that these people are lying and have confidence to challenge their lies. But there's a simple word, if they won't get their thugs to beat you up, if you ask it, which is, tell me why. Why is that the case? What's going on? Why is it, Mr. Farage, for example, that you have so much wealth that you never declare it properly, and yet you say you're the friend of people like me who's got tuppence? Why is it that you spent years getting an enormous salary in the EU and never doing anything, and then we heard by accident being abusive to women members of staff there? Why is it you worked there on a sinecure for all those years when you say the EU is a bad thing and shouldn't be supported? Questions like that, I think, would be quite helpful. But I think this populism is very powerful. People are prepared to listen to it, even though we know that its road leads in many bad directions. And what could be worse for us? I mean, I don't know if any of you have had recent experience, but the NHS, even in all its difficulties, is still a wonderful thing to have. And when you compare it with the experience of so many Americans, but then what do we hear about America? We hear that less than half Americans vote. So it's a clear run for people from extreme positions. And we know also that groups facing particular oppression in America, sometimes because they are forced not to, don't vote. We know that black people vote less than white people, and we know why. So I don't want to go too far from our borders, but I hope that's a bit helpful. But people who tell lies, I mean, don't forget, the person who first talked about phony truth was the biggest liar of all, President Trump. And that, I'm not saying I'm able to say the biggest liar of all because it's a well-evidenced statement. And we're sticking to the evidence rules, aren't we?
Thank you.
Anybody else? I mean, maybe it's a better idea just to have a few questions now and let people have their break, rather than have to drag back. Anybody else want to? I just hope everyone will end up feeling they want to be a social worker. That's what I hope. And there's a lot of lived experience, obviously, in this room, and I feel, I'm thinking of there being a lot of women in this room. That's why I said that. And I do put more faith in women than I do in men, I have to be honest. But I think social work is such a powerful, because we know that government uses it in negative ways. Just to say, one of our daughters is now an assistant director of social services. And she was saying to us, she works with children, and she said she thinks now that the market for services for children, residential services, has been taken over by private companies. And she thinks some of the private companies are so disreputable that they're actually using those services for money laundering. I mean, I don't know if that's come your way, but I know that their private equity companies are now big in providing services for looked after children. And bearing in mind the ethos that governs those services, It's a very frightening thought that some of the most vulnerable, at-risk people in our society are having to rely on those which may not be paying their staff proper wages, probably are understaffed, charging enormous amounts, aren't they? It's a very worrying prospect. Sorry, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so sorry, the lady was saying that, and you also alluded to that sometimes the social work, we have the client or the service user and the social worker, but some of the services are provided by people who are not the client or the social worker respects matter. So how do you try to influence policy from a social worker perspective?
As a social work practitioner?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really difficult because, to be truthful, the policy process now is such a distant and remote and complicated one. And I've seen it changed over my period of activity. Earlier, under New Labour, for example, and even before that, I was actively involved at a ministerial level in politics relating to social work, social care, social policy. And you did have the feeling, alongside other people, both as a service user and as a policy maker, and with practitioners sometimes involved. And as Suzy said, she was involved as a trustee in some key organisations. You had a feeling you could make a difference. I think that's very difficult to say now. Just think of one domain of policy. I had this conversation with a friend that I've worked with a lot about this, social care. We know there's a review taking place now under, I can't remember the name of the woman who's doing it, Dame somebody, she's doing a review, and so far I've read the first report she's produced. But what people say about social care is it seems to be like a no-go area for politics. Nothing ever happens. You know, if you're not one of the few people eligible for free social care, if you don't qualify for social care under the National Health Service, which they're very deliberately, most people don't, then you have to pay for it. And we know from what Age UK has said, I think they're now saying it's nearly 2 million people who are eligible for social care who can't access it. And social care costs, and it costs a lot of money, and it's become a world of two nations, hasn't it? Those who can afford decent social care and those who can't. And there's many who can't, and some have to go where it may not be appropriate into residential services, and some don't get the help they need at home. I mean, we've watched that series on television called Ambulance, and how often, I don't know if others of you watch it, but how often you see ambulance persons who, you know, I think are so impressive, basically taking on roles like that of social workers or care workers, because the person is on their own, hasn't got enough care as either an older person or perhaps a mental health service user, but maybe even in a crisis. And the help isn't readily there. And so it's a matter of the ambulance person coming, of course, then they have to go, and there's no ongoing support, especially if the person hasn't got family or friends. I mean, Suzy said it earlier on, loneliness, and they often say it in a vague way, loneliness is so important, but how are ordinary people meant to reach out? Everyone is having to work longer hours, more stressfully, for less pay. That's the truth of the labour market currently. So it's really difficult for us, perhaps always in a society, to do as much for each other as we might want to. Plus also we know that, you know, if you want, like our children, you or in other circumstances, having to get a job, you can't be nearby anymore. Communities are not the same. And having electronic and social media communities is not the same as having communities where someone's just drops in. I mean, you've seen that even in Norwich, where it's different to London. So I think there are some very big problems here, which are about the fact that we have a labour market that's not really prioritising the concerns of the people as workers or service users. And we're facing something that it's impossible to know what direction it will head, which is why my organisation, Shaping Our Lives, is trying to find out more from the point of view of people perhaps needing particularly to know, disabled people and other service users. What about when we have artificial intelligence and when they're talking not just about replacing people in jobs, but as someone said to me the other day, if you have artificial intelligence and people aren't earning wages, where are the markets going to come from? Who's going to be buying the goods? I hadn't got that far in my thinking, but it's true. Because the economy I think artificial intelligence, like everything, is a neutral. It's who runs it with what values and what principles. And we know at the moment it's people like Elon Musk who are running artificial intelligence and enormous American companies. So it's not reassuring. And they're blithely going ahead with things like driverless taxis and other things. When we know that many jobs, I understand from talking to a friend who spends quite a lot of time in China, that in China, the delivery people, when we were in Uxbridge yesterday, I've never seen so many, because there aren't as many in, people with their scooters and their bikes. But he said in China, blocks of flats, they don't go in the flats, they have robots that do it. So I think those are jobs that are going to be replaced. China is very far ahead, I think, in terms of robotics. And so that you can see they've massively expanded those jobs, but for how long? And you might also ask, with what security are they present there, and what kind of jobs are we equipping for a society that says it wants skills and reliability for its workers and its incomes? There's so much uncertainty, but we know that at the moment, the politics and ideology driving it are not one that seem to be concerned with the interests of most people, or particularly the interests of people who might be marginalised. Do people have these kind of worries as well?
Yeah. And one thing I've observed, I went to university in the north, so northeast, Hull to be precise, and it didn't occur to me, but when I was there, the council were building houses to house older people instead of going to their homes and doing social care. So to them, it was cheaper to concentrate these older people at one place, then look after them, rather than pay a private company to pay poorly somebody to go around their houses for like 15 minutes to make them a meal or something like that. So there was a sharp contrast between the north and the south. But I don't see such thing here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They've got quite a lot of that in Norwich. They've got it's roughly called sheltered housing or supported housing, but a lot of it, they've got a lot of different complexes. Yeah. They do work well. A lot of people really, really like it, and they make friends, and some of them organise activities themselves. Yes. There's actually one just down the road from where we live, and there was two men who decided to do Christmas dinner, cook it themselves, and they got people to sign up for it, and 20 people signed up for it. But I think it does mean that people have really accessible housing. So if it's done well, if it's done properly, it really can work. And there are some really lovely little complexes around Norwich.
Oh, and environmentally good as well, aren't they?
Yeah. But again, of course, obviously some people want to stay in their own home, and then as Peter said, as you've said, there isn't the support for people. And I think obviously it is a political issue, and it is depressing because they know that social care is incredibly important, but nobody wants to do it. I mean, I meet people all the time at Age UK who aren't getting, so they've got their benefit, like attendance allowance. It's the benefit for people over state pension age who are seen as sick and disabled. That's meant for personal care, and you can use that to pay for some personal care. But if you get the higher rate, it's only £110 a week, and the lower rates, it's gone up a bit, 114 now. And then the higher rate was £73.10, but it'll have gone up a few pounds after the beginning of April. But that would only buy you, 2 hours a week or something, or maybe 3 if you're lucky. But for a lot of people who are state pension age anyway, they're quite hard up. So when they get this benefit, that might mean they then get more pension credit or actually become entitled to pension credit. So for the first time their income is a bit more comfortable. Well, the last thing they want to do is spend it all on social care, so they'll go without. or they'll get a family member to do it.
Yeah.
So you meet a lot of very stressed family members. And, you know, I know that the contrast, my own mother, who lived to be a month before she was 100, when she was at home, she did actually have some savings and could afford to pay for private care. Now, it wasn't all brilliant. There was a hilarious incident with one of her carers who was called Sue. And one day my sister said to me, when she's talking about the lovely Suzy, she said, is she talking about you or this carer? And we quickly discovered that she was talking about this carer, Suzy. But this carer, my mother was frightened of her. And it took I said to my sister one day, I'm worried about this carer. I think mum's frightened of her. My sister said, oh, I feel really guilty. I meant to say to you. She said X, Y, Z. I meant to say to you. So I talked to my mother about it. My mother was somebody who could never have a rational conversation with. So it wasn't me sitting down with my mother and having a proper conversation. It was like, no, you're not to do anything. Anyway, I did involve the manager of the agency. And we had this meeting where my mother firmly denied that this woman was a problem at all, but then gave the game away by then telling the manager that Suzy says I should do X, Y, Z, not meaning me. Anyway, what was agreed as a compromise was this woman would come far less often. And in fact, what that meant, she was so aggrieved, she left altogether. But after my mother eventually went into a care home, and after she left, I found this Christmas card addressed to Suzy. And I thought, well, that's funny. She never gave me my Christmas card. So I opened it. And it was all about, you are the most wonderful person on the planet. And I'm so sorry that you've left the organisation. So I realised, oh, it's not me. But what was so interesting was, oh, no, that's right. Sorry. My mother hadn't yet gone into the care home. I was sorting things out for her. But then after the woman had left she'd been gone 6 months, and the rule was once they'd been gone 6 months, they could then go back and see the person they'd been looking after, but they weren't allowed to go back before that. There had to be a gap. They weren't allowed to make contact. And there had been COVID at this time, and she got a postcard from this woman who said, I'd like to come and see you, dear Joan, I miss you so much. I'd like to come and see you. We could sit in the garden together. And my mother was terribly upset and said to me, I'm really frightened, didn't want to see her. So she'd written this card, but she didn't want to see it. And I said, nothing to worry about, Mum. We just don't answer the postcard. I said, we won't phone her up. She doesn't have to come. And that was that. But it was interesting because obviously, if I hadn't been there, what would have happened with my mother, with this carer? And this is a private agency of good repute. Some of the other carers were marvellous. So, you know, for me, I think there needs to be a universalist social care service run by local authorities with proper checks and balances. Free at the point of delivery, where people know what's going on. And I think it is a real concern.
Can I just add to that something, going back to research? Suzy mentioned the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that do a lot of social policy related research, but they did a project years ago now, and they published a report from it called That Little Bit of Help. And the point of that research it was a proper piece of research, a national project, was that they found out that if people who were beginning to be a bit frail had a bit of help, it would delay things getting worse. Going back to the kind of things that you've been saying, what are we talking about? We're talking about a cost-effective approach by being preventive to the issues that arise when we acquire impairments and get older, which of course doesn't enter the logic of this kind of market-based system because it's about profit. And the other thing, and I'll stop talking, that struck me about social care, which has been a field I've studied a lot and done a lot of writing about, is I don't know a field where predominant policy is basically so simplistic and crude, actually. I'm not criticising the workers. When we did that big project Suzy mentioned, one of the strap lines of what we found out was everything that was good about the projects, the social care we saw was down to the people working in it. Everything that was problematic was the systems they were working in. But it doesn't work because the logic of the market is not the logic of looking after each other. And the little bit of help idea was a great one, but lost, you know, well evidenced and lost. It's a shame.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for both talks. This is a question about going back about co-production and participating, working in partnership. And it's interesting what you were saying about, like, well, actually, we do need to be aware of the system that we are living in and the politics that governs that system. Also, in what it means when we work with people in partnership, and whether do they have, for instance, all the power to set the agenda, or are we giving them just three options for them to choose from? And the challenges of sometimes what happens when the people that we work with want to go in one direction, and we as professionals think, well, actually, that's a really bad idea, or that is not going to work as well. And I was thinking about something that you were saying, Suzy, about how important it is for people to be able to share their experience, to say whatever it is that they have to say. And often, my impression is that we've lost that sense of imagination, of things could be different. And the decisions that we need to make, or the decisions that we put on the table as social workers or for the people, are already limited, because there is not the ability for people to imagine, but what would you like to happen? And it's so important to speak. What is it that I would like to happen, even if it's not a reality, because without it, then there's no advancement. So how can you have that conversation when you know the context, when you know the welfare system, the constraints, but how do you keep in the conversation in which there is space for reimagining, for speaking, this should not be like this is what I would like to get?
Do you want to start?
I suppose I think that the key thing is your relationship with the service user. I think it is incredibly important to have a relationship, to build a relationship. Clearly there will be conflicts, clearly there will be difficulties, but to build a relationship of trust. I do remember years and years ago, many years ago, a colleague and I went to a talk given by a social work educator at Middlesex University, and he was talking about the importance of empathy. And afterwards, Leslie said to me, what she'd realised was, I just thought he was a bit odd, but what she realised was that he was talking about empathy like you project empathy, not that you really feel it, but there is this thing called empathy, and you've got to use it as a tool so that you're learning what to say and how to say it, and you're using empathy. But what was clear was he didn't mean you'd actually have empathy. And I realised, yeah, she's absolutely right. That's why the whole thing felt so weird and disconnected. So I think empathy is absolutely crucial, and it's about you do have to try and build a relationship. It doesn't mean you always like somebody. You know, there will be times when you actually don't like someone. You can't like all your clients. You can't like all your patients in palliative care. You can't like
or even all your colleagues.
No, but it is about building that relationship and trying to put aside your own personal feelings about something, but being yourself and being prepared to be yourself. Like that man said to me, you know, you were yourself. You shared something of yourself, is what he was trying to say. I don't mean by that you're telling everyone your life story or all your problems and so on, but I think that's what it's about, so that they have respect and trust for you and will respect that you're being honest with them. Well, this isn't possible, but I'm prepared to listen, and we can perhaps develop some ideas, and who knows, maybe some of the things you talk about we can do in some ways. But I think what is crucial is who you are, being yourself.
And I'd add something else from that, from my experience, because as I said, I have been involved in sitting around these fancy tables with ministers and the rest of it, and not a lot gets achieved really ever. I don't think that way. I think we have to think again about what's big and what's small. But what I think really made the difference for me, and I said it right at the beginning, was meeting other people with similar experience, and I think being able to learn from each other, whatever it may be to do with work, it may be to do with who we are, it may be to do with a problem we've got, but I came to a completely different understanding about my distress from being with people who'd had more chance than I had to have the confidence to think about what it meant. People going through the most terrible times, multiple sections, all sorts of awful things, being abused, treated in terrible ways by being isolated in segregation and all that stuff, who, because of the horrors that they'd experienced, had learnt things and they could share with me. And I couldn't say that my experiences were as terrible as theirs. Some of them of distress may have been, but not of the system. And I think it's what we can do within our own heads, like the course, what you said at the beginning. That's the crucial thing, how we change. The other thing, just to add to that, is that I realise that the politicians I'm not very keen on, they're forever telling us not about our lives that we live, but they're telling us about the lives that we should imagine we're living. It's what they call it the aspirational society. So I can't remember the names of all these different leaders of the Tory party or the Labour Party. There've been loads, but they want us to aspire to not who we are, not things we're not. What we should be thinking about is who we are, our actual rights and needs, and those of others, our peers, and how we can make them better. Because I think, and I don't know, we sit having conversations, we wonder how we're lucky we're old, as it were, in the sense that we've done our work in life, and we've both got pensions. And pensions will not be as good in the future as we managed to have. So we do sit there saying to each other, how do people manage? And I think the bottom line is they don't. But how do so many people manage with great difficulty, I think? And that's what they've done. So no wonder they want you to think about or if you watch telly, as I like watching telly, endless advertisements for taking part in lotteries, and all the charities now have lotteries. I don't know how they can justify it. Or the street where you live, you can sign up. The big lottery, which we've just benefited from. So many lotteries that you can find a way forward by chance, but you won't. And we need to try and anchor ourselves against all the rubbish that comes our way. That's my feeling. And talk with each other and talk with our families and learn from our children and learn from those we love and respect that we can trust. Because I think that's another thing that's taken as a given, what Suzy's saying. It's about building trust. I've done lots of projects, research projects, and with service users. And the thing that service users, from my experience internationally, say the most that they want is to be listened to. And it's hardly surprising because so often people aren't listened to. And that's what social workers are good at doing. And that's one of the ways forward. But sometimes I feel like, what can you achieve with policy? It's very difficult, isn't it? I'm not saying give up, because I didn't, but it's hard. But with your colleagues and peers and yourself, you can make such a difference. But people might say it's only a small thing. I don't think it is a small thing. I think it's a big thing. That's us done, I think.
Let's contribute. Which is what Suzy said around something that Suzy mentioned about services, trying to provide person-centered services, but sometimes that comes out with what's available. And I think, recently I've been able to just, see that at work. Sometimes you want to place a child, you listen to the child, but it's about what's available.
Yeah.
Not what the child has told you and around their person-centered needs. It's really around what's available sometimes. So just really thinking about that, thinking, in such cases, what can one really do?
I think you're right. And just to say one thing that you remember Daphne Statham, who used to run something called the National Institute for Social Work when we had a National Institute. She was a lovely person and a very committed person to social work. And she used to talk about smuggling in good practice to social work. It wasn't what you were supposed to be doing, but trying to do it regardless. And that reminded me of a colleague of Suzy's who, after he'd finished a job, was still working. He was a student here, wasn't he? After he was still working with someone that he was no longer meant to be working with. He would be told by his agency, you must have a fixed term of work. I'm not recommending this because the poor soul was worn out, but you have to try and find ways of breaking their rules without damaging yourself or anybody else.
I suppose I would actually say, don't underestimate the importance of what your work and relationship with that child is. And don't underestimate what difference you might make. Even if you don't see the child more than a few times, never underestimate the effect you can have and the importance you might make. And it may not be that the placement is what you would have wanted for the child or the child wanted, but your interaction with the child might make an incredibly crucial difference.
Please can you all join me in thanking Peter and Suzy again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your questions and comments, which are helpful and are reassuring. It cheers me up, this people still at it, trying.